The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
It's been a little while since we talked about 3D printing, which I find super interesting. I feel like lately the sort of tech stories have been focused on space travel, autonomous vehicles, sort of crypto or blockchain technologies. What else have we been talking about tech-wise? Some space discovery type stuff, but we haven't really talked about 3D printing much. And there's a really interesting new 3D printing story. South by Southwest has been going on in Austin, Texas, and there's a Texas-based startup company called Icon, which has unveiled plans to print a 650 square foot house for $10,000, and they hope that they might eventually be able to reduce the price to only $4,000. It would be made of cement, and it would take up to 1 day to be printed by large 3D robots. And the idea is a lot of people need affordable housing. Even if they can't afford $4,000 or $10,000 themselves, you can build a lot of houses if they each cost $4,000 to $10,000 with a $20 million government grant, for example, and that this could do a lot to create adequate shelter, particularly in parts of the world where people don't even really have the ability to make modern cement structures even. And they're going to start in El Salvador, where they're going to build 100 houses sometime next year, and then they hope to go to other countries in the future. The complexities here are several. Number one, in order to do a 3D printed building, you need a schematic, which needs to be perfectly designed. That needs to then be connected to the computer that will tell the massive printer where the cement goes and what needs to be built. And it's a technological marvel. It has complexities, but it's absolutely and totally doable. And I am very interested in the future of 3D printing, the ability to 3D print all sorts of household items in your own house. We've already seen 3D printed prosthetic limbs. There's the possibility at some point of going more in the direction of Neil Stephenson and his Matter compiler, which could basically 3D print food from the basic components, the basic elements that make up the real world. And that would be an interesting thing, but that's probably further along into the future.
People aren't really too supportive of GMOs by and large. So
which I disagree with, by the way.
Food, yeah, me too. But would they be all for 3D printed food? Maybe not.
Hey, if it's if you can tell them it's organic, which relates to our next story, then maybe they would. I don't know.
Yeah, maybe too early to transition into that.
Are you a big 3D printing guy?
I think it's pretty cool. I'd love to see the size of this one, especially if it's going to be building houses. I'm sure you do
the
it
size of the printer
piece by piece.
Yeah.
But I'd love to see the size of the printer itself.
Yep.
And I think this could be a solution or one of many solutions to homelessness as well. If you get some philanthropists, I think, to invest millions of dollars into this, that could shelter a lot of people, I think. You were mentioning government grants. I could see some rich person deciding that he was going to invest a lot of money into this as well.
Either one. I mean, I think a lot of it is the sort of PR appeal of it, because that same rich guy or gal, Betsy DeVos maybe, if she cared about this type of thing, maybe she's a big philanthropist, I don't know. They could already choose to invest in expanding the number of homeless shelters, for example. Of course, the downside to that is that it's not permanent housing that someone owns. It's just a place that you're allowed to stay. But I guess my point is there's a lot of people who could already be investing much more money in solving homelessness. Maybe the idea of some frontier pushing technology like 3D printing will just make it seem more appealing to them, because they'll think, oh, 3D printing, that sounds really cool.
Yeah, I mean, homeless shelters are never seen as a permanent solution, of course. And I think the idea is for someone to stay there for maybe a few days and then to wander on to the next place.
Yeah.
I take it they probably stay within the same city, but go around from one shelter to another, maybe only stay there as often as they need it. Whereas this is a permanent solution, so I think people would be a lot more inclined to invest in this than building a bunch of homeless shelters.
Yeah.
And there is that PR aspect.
The only caveat would be that in general, the places that are most being targeted for these 3D printed houses are not the same types of places that have homeless shelters. Like homeless shelters mostly exist in, at least, you know, we're talking about in the United States, in cities, in places with higher populations. The idea here is first to go to places where they don't even have structures that are stronger than what sometimes are very precarious tin roof and hut type structures, and that also just in terms of safety and stability would be a major change. So I think that they're actually thinking about it even for different places, and that's another
Yeah.
thing. Some philanthropists are more interested in helping in the developing world than in the developed world. Other philanthropists say, I don't really want to think so much about the developing world. I want to improve American cities, for example.
Right.
And, there's plenty of problems to go around for whoever wants to deal with either.
It's interesting how in the city, it's going to be probably more expensive to buy the plot of land to put your house on
Than the 10 grand,
than
yeah.
the 4 to 10 grand to pay for the house itself. I
Yep.
mean, you don't normally find that.
No, particularly not in San Francisco, New York, Boston, and all of the other places. Detroit might be the one place where you can get yourself some land for $4,000 to $10,000, and then maybe build the house for
Yeah.
$4,000 to $10,000.
I wonder if you can stack these, make it into an apartment complex. I'd like
Who
to see
knows?
what the house is like itself. I'm
Probably.
sure it's very basic.
Yeah.
Like a bathroom and a bedroom and maybe a porch too.
Yep, and I think they also have a man cave built in as part of it. No, I'm kidding. Okay, organic versus natural food labels. We've talked for a long time about how natural food labels basically mean nothing. It's not a regulated term, but organic on food is a regulated term, regulated by the USDA. The problem that we're now having is that the Trump administration is going to pull an Obama-era rule which would have set new standards for the way animals should be treated if their meat is going to be sold as organic. And the USDA announced earlier this week that they are withdrawing the final rule, which had been delayed multiple times, including in November, set to take effect in May. And the argument is that the requirements it would have put in place went above and beyond the authority that the USDA has to set such requirements, and that it could have decreased participation in the national organic program. And so they are going to be doing away with it. And this has to do with the way in which poultry is housed in spaces that the animals have to have the room to move about freely and stretch their wings and stand normally, engage in natural behaviors. Livestock need to have outdoor space access year-round, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And bottom line, the USDA is saying that they only have some authority to regulate this stuff and not the authority to regulate others. So at least when it comes... Now, to be clear, this was never enacted, right? So the current organic standards are remaining unchanged. There was the expectation or the possibility of those standards being increased, and that's not going to happen, and that is what it is.
Yeah, I'd like to see what the actual definition of organic is, because I always thought it was something like a food not treated with any chemical compounds or hormones.
Yeah.
Or maybe preservatives too. But it seems like based on this definition from the story, it has more to do with allowing the life source to live out its natural life as it normally would in the wild.
Well,
something like that?
the livestock and poultry guidelines are separate from the general organic. So I think what you're sort of citing are the minimums across all foods for organic. But then when it comes to livestock and poultry, I don't think it applies to fish.
Yeah.
For livestock and poultry, there's another set of guidelines that has to do with sort of the conditions for the animal. So I think that that's just sort of like a subset of general organic guidelines.
So they need their own cage. They have to be able to turn around. All that stuff has to be somewhat sanitary, I'd imagine, too.
Yeah, there's a whole list of rules, which again are unchanged. And we're not talking about the ones that are already in place, which are unchanged, but the making stricter of the rules is not going to be happening. So basically, for most people, it's more of there's anger that it's not being made more strict, but in terms of what one would already either be willing or not willing to buy based on its organic designation, nothing is changing. It's just we're sticking with the rules that we have now. And then there's, of course, all of the other arguments about, listen, is anything really organic? Because even organic vegetables are receiving irrigation, at least if they're outdoor vegetables, from water that could be acidic as a result of the Industrial Revolution. Is anything truly, really organic? And then, of course, we kind of get into this postmodernist thing of, does anything really have meaning? And you can take it pretty far. But listen, there are guidelines for what counts as organic, and we can say the guidelines are good or the guidelines are not good, but at least there are guidelines, which we can't say for all natural.
Yeah, I feel like with the companies that allow its livestock to walk around freely, that don't use cages and all these horrible techniques to keep them in control,
Yep.
they probably advertise that, right? They'll put cage free on everything and make sure that the public understands that they treat their animals pretty well until they kill
Some of
them, I
them
guess.
do. Yeah, I mean, you see cage-free as a label on eggs now.
Yeah.
And then maybe also on poultry itself. So
Right.
certainly there's certainly so there's financial cost to doing organic, and then there's financial value to being able to say that it's organic. And in the net, whether you come out ahead or behind, I don't
Yeah.
know.
So
Probably
if
ahead.
companies that can mistreat the animals more so than, say, the other ones that are a little bit more liberal towards the idea can also label their product as organic. Maybe that's a little bit deceptive to people in the market, to consumers.
I'm not sure I
because
know
they
what you
don't
mean.
know exactly what they're getting.
So you're saying if the standard for organic is lowered, it allows a wider range
Just
of.
about anyone can put that on there, and
Yes.
people don't know what's what.
Certainly, yeah. But to be clear, that's not what's happening here. So no standards are being lowered here. They're just not going to be
not
raised.
gonna
And
enforce them,
certainly
yeah.
raising them would
Raise them.
presumably reduce the number of companies that would be allowed to say that. But in any case, no change is going to be made, and a lot of people displeased with that. There's a new study from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology just down the road from us, which is completely unsurprising in its results. It studied fake news, and it found that fake news on Twitter spreads more rapidly than real news does, and not by a slim margin, by a substantial margin when fake news articles enter the ether of Twitter. They are retweeted and reposted and responded to at a much greater rate than real news. And there was speculation that it might be due to bots, because there are bots programmed to spread fake news, but it's not because of that. What the study finds is that no, it's just the fake news itself is more interesting to users to spread. So I find this completely unsurprising. The whole point of fake news is to be spread, right? Nobody's writing fake news not to be spread. And you can make the same case for regular news, but the truth is that there's lots of regular news that to a general audience is pretty boring, but it's accurate. So that's why it's being written. Nobody's going to waste their time on milquetoast fake news, because the entire point of fake news is to spread fake news. So I'm not at all surprised by this. We know that people are much more taken in by salacious and titillating narratives and headlines, and those, of course, are statistically more likely to be fake, because it's true, like it's just a reality of the world, that a lot of the news that happens each day is kind of boring to big populations. So when you are specifically creating articles and news and headlines that are fake, you are going to make them as triggering to the interest of minds as possible. And I think the study is telling us something we all would have guessed is very, very obvious.
Yeah, but maybe the degree to which fake news is spreading is surprising, and I think it was to me. I guess it spreads at a rate 10 times faster than an average news story, and it's a fake news story is 70% more likely to be retweeted as well than a regular story.
Not surprising. Not surprising. I mean, the scale to which, the degree to which it is more likely to be spread, I would assume is drastically different. There's also another study which shows, again, not surprisingly, and I read about this one over the weekend, that right-wingers are drastically more likely to retweet and reshare fake news than are left-wingers.
Like twice as much, something like that?
I don't remember the numbers, but now you could make the case that you have to look at the base rate, and I don't know the answer to this, but if there is much more fake news attacking the left that is appealing to the right, there's also just a lot more material for the right to be retweeting and spreading. So I think that at an intuitive level, it's not at all shocking to me that the right is much more likely to retweet and reshare fake news than the left. But I think that if we want to be sort of appropriately skeptical, we also want to adjust for how much fake news there is that would appeal to a right-wing view versus a left-wing view. You've got to account for that to some degree.
I feel like the left now, too, has so much sensationalist content that they can share without having to make anything up because Republicans are in charge because of the ongoing Russia investigation.
Yeah.
Trump's hirings and firings that seem to happen every single day.
Yep.
They don't have to make stuff up, whereas Republicans have to resort to something because they don't have any control.
That is true, although when President Obama was president of the United States, you also saw the fake news disproportionately perpetrated by the right. And at that time, it was because they were in the outsider position and there to attack. So we've seen the fake news disproportionately infect the right, both during a Democratic administration and during a Republican administration, which does suggest to me that there might be something inherent to the Republican brain that makes them either more susceptible to or more interested in spreading fake news, although we're purely speculating.
Right. I mean, but the Trump scandals are legitimate, I would have to say, whereas the Obama ones aren't. So I don't think, years after the tan suit scandal and the Dijon mustard scandal, Republicans can get away with retweeting stuff like that. They had to make something up.
Right, yeah. So Obama didn't really have scandals, so the right had to make something up, and that would explain why the right was spreading more fake news than the left during Obama. At
that time, yeah.
Under Trump, the left doesn't have to make stuff up because there are constant scandals, and as a result, the right is forced to, or maybe in a situation where it's much more interesting or useful to them or enticing to create and try to spread fake news. But big picture, 0.0% shock about the news from MIT about the spread of fake news. And that's actually something we're considering a long-form piece on upcoming. But more on that at some other point. That's it for this week. We'll talk to you Monday.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.